Good evening. I want to welcome you to the Spring 2008 Provost Distinguished Lecture. I am Phyllis Wise, and I'm the Provost here. This Provost Distinguished Lecture Series was started about 2 years ago when I realized that so many days, almost every day, we have many distinguished speakers coming from around the world who are world-renowned experts in one area or another. But when you look around, oftentimes the best people are actually here as faculty at the University of Washington. And so we started this series where every fall and every spring we have a speaker from our very own faculty talk on a topic that is really highly relevant to our current times. We've had speakers in global health, in early childhood learning, and the environment. And tonight we are incredibly privileged to have Joel Migdal be the speaker for the spring. This is a wonderful partnership between the UW Alumni Association and the University of Washington, the Provost's office. And together we are able to bring in this kind of a crowd. If it weren't for the UW Alumni Association and their wonderful ability to communicate with all of you, to advertise the kinds of activities that are going on at the university, we probably wouldn't have this many people. The university's commitment to discovery is truly grounded in cutting-edge scholarship, and there can be no better example of that than Dr. Migdal. He is the Robert F. Phillip Professor of International Studies at the Henry M. Jackson School for International Studies, which, by the way, will be celebrating its 100th anniversary next year. You probably saw scrolling on your screen as you sat the kinds of activities that will be going on this year and next. Professor Migdal started his career at Harvard University and at Tel Aviv University and has been here on the faculty for about 25 years. He is an outstanding example of the kind of scholarship and teacher that we have here at the university. He's won the Distinguished Teaching Award as well as the Distinguished Graduate Mentor Award. For nearly 3 decades, he's really inspired students in his classrooms. He has been recognized in several different areas, only one of which he's talking about tonight. In fact, he said if you had questions, he could go into the topic of the Middle East, which he really wasn't going to talk about tonight. Instead, tonight he's going to be talking about fostering democracy from the ground up, and I'm really, really honored to introduce to you Professor Joel Migdal.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming tonight. It's really a pleasure to see such a large crowd. And thank you to Phyllis, Provost Weiss, and the UW Alumni Association, and particularly Paul Rucker, who has been coordinating everything and guiding me through this whole process. So in the next hour, I want to speak about the world's poor. People who earn less than $2 or less than $1 a day. The people who earn less than $2 a day make up about half the world's population. And the people who earn less than $1 a day make up about 1/6 of the world's population. The question I want to address in the next hour or so is whether the growing number of democracies around the world can include the poor. Can the poor become viable members of the public, influencing the institutions that shape their lives? The answer that I'm going to give, I'm afraid, is very qualified. While new programs initiated by poverty-fighting groups around the world, including here in Seattle, now do have the poor participating in new institutions, knocking on the door of old institutions, the walls of exclusion still remain very high. So what I want to do now is divide this talk into 4 parts. First, I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by democracy and what democracy entails. Second, I want to examine this question of world poverty, give some dimensions and scope to it, and talk about the exclusion of the poor from the institutions that determine their fates. I then want to turn to a case in which the walls of exclusion were actually scaled, and a more inclusive public was created, and that's the case of the United States in the mid to late 19th century. And finally, I want to bring us back to the 21st century and today's poor in the world, where I will look at how some efforts, specifically what I call the Seattle model, hold some hope for more control by the poor over their lives, but also how formidable obstacles still exist. In the 1980s and 1990s, there was a remarkable process in which authoritarian governments, even brutal dictatorships, moved towards democracy. From Korea to Chile, from Poland to Taiwan, democracy became the common form of government. This was not the first time we had seen a proliferation of democracies around the world. There was a wave of democracies in the late 18th century when the United States came online, and early 19th century. Then again, a wave in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And now this third wave of democracy, starting in the 1980s or so, has made democracy the global norm of governance. If you look at this chart, we see that starting in 1987, we had 66 democracies and almost double that number by 2007. And we've had a growth in the number of countries since that time, but even in percentage terms, we find that in 1987, about 2/5 of the countries in the world were democracies, at least by these measures. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And now almost 2/3 of the world's countries are democracies. If we look at an organization called Freedom House, it develops a map of freedom. And this map pretty much correlates with democracy. We don't have to go into the differences between what they mean by freedom and democracy. But as you can see, the dark green areas are largely democratic. The yellow parts are kind of transitional or on the cusp. And finally, the purple parts are not democratic. So what do we mean by democracy? Most often, policymakers and scholars refer simply, as in the charts that we saw a moment ago, to electoral democracy. That is, if there are free and fair elections, if governments can be replaced, if there is that sort of accountability, we have democracy. And in a broader sense, it looks beyond simply electoral mechanisms to other sorts of mechanisms as well. The rule of law, independent judiciary, agencies that exist to protect the population's civil rights, various sorts of checks and balances and oversight, the accountability of government, and the relationship of civil leaders to military leaders. All of these mechanisms of democracy, elections and all the rest, are kind of the standard way that scholars and policymakers alike understand democracy. When the United States, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, tried to nurture democracy, it went exactly to these sorts of measures. It tried to create a constitution, a parliament, a court system that was independent, all the mechanisms of democracy. But this is not all of what democracy means. Others understand democracy not by looking exclusively at the government, but at the population as a whole. And in particular, a whole realm of political science and sociological literature have looked at what they call the civic culture. That is, the degree to which people hold a certain set of values, a sense of their ability to change the world, to affect the world they live in, as the measure of democracy. Neither of these measures, though, gets at an issue of prime importance in democracies. Do people have a reasonable chance to participate in, even lead the institutions that deeply affect their lives? The great sociologist Barrington Moore addressed this question. He wrote this 2 decades after India was created as a democracy in 1947. And he noted that poor people in India's rural areas at that time lacked the opportunity to play a meaningful part in determining their own fate, in determining and shaping their lives. And as such, democracy did not really exist. So to put it more broadly, democracy involves not only representation, not only holding certain civic values, it doesn't involve only elections and the rule of law, but it involves the existence of a coherent public. By public, I mean the community or people as an organized body, as a whole, in which there is no hereditary or special rank or privilege. Now, obviously, this is an ideal type. Almost nowhere do we find a public that is totally egalitarian in this sense. At first glance, this definition of the public seems highly inclusive. But the word organized in there kind of complicates it. Organized here doesn't mean organized in the sense of a formal structure that coordinates activities. Rather, organized here means a whole whose parts are all performing key functions and connected to one another in a non-hierarchical way. That is, that there is no a priori special rank or special privilege. A public is coordinated through its institutions, and those institutions are key in determining both the fate of the community as a whole and the fates of its individual members. Through its institutions, the public directly addresses its own concerns, and it also gives voice to the government of its demands, its concerns, its dissatisfactions, its interests, and all the rest. Now, obviously, no public has totally equal access for all to its institutions, access without regard to special rank or privilege. But we can judge democracies on the degree to which they access, for everyday people, the institutions of society, the degree to which access is open to all segments of society. The question in assessing democracy is, to what degree glass ceilings exist for certain groups? Or even more ominously, to what degree do walls of exclusion exist? It was the lack of access for India's rural poor to the public, to the institutions that determine their fate, that led Barrington Moore Jr. 40 years ago to say that democracy did not yet exist in India's countryside. Let me turn to this question of poverty, because not much has changed and everything has changed since Barrington Moore wrote those words back in 1966. The poor continue to have little access to broader institutions that could give them a role in determining their own futures, their own fates, their own lives. Without ties to financial institutions or workers' organizations or producer associations and more, the poor have little ability to organize their own lives or to influence others who may organize their lives. This is a quote from a World Bank study. The study is based on interviews with over 40,000 of the world's poor in more than 50 different countries. Now, this is kind of interesting because the poor report also that they have a very positive image of what government should be. Their experience has not made them totally cynical. They have an idea of what government should be doing and what their relationship to government should be. But at the same time, as the quote indicates, they report that in actual practice, they have very limited access to governmental institutions, whether to receive services or to voice their concerns or to organize action. They face not only rudeness and humiliation, they face extensive corruption as well. If we look for a second at this table, it basically shows the percentage of income that firms and households end up paying, in this case Ecuador, but I don't think it's too different in many other places, in bribes. If you look at the left, a small firm employing fewer than 11 people will pay as much as 8% of its total disposable income in bribes. Large firms, while paying more money, actually end up paying a little over 1% of their income in bribes. And the same pattern holds for households. Most of the poor also report in this study that they have very few contacts with nonprofit organizations. And their assessments of their interactions with these organizations are not very positive. They often find those interactions discouraging. So the poor, quite simply, lack access to the key elements of democracy. They lack access to the linkages that would connect them to decision makers, to institutions that could change their lives. These linkages are often quite material. They lack the roads to travel to the district capital, or they lack means of communication. The missing links for the poor also means that they simply do not participate in commercial and social organizations, producer associations, and the like, that reach to decision makers or that can make officials more attentive to them. As the World Bank report concluded, it's no surprise that in this institutional environment, the experiences of poor people are characterized by lack of power and voicelessness. The result is that the poor are not meaningful parts of the public of the countries they're in. Their exclusion makes democracy ring hollow. Here is a map of world poverty, people living on less than $1 a day. And what I want to indicate here is simply that we're not talking about isolated pockets of poverty. In the map, the darker colors refer to higher percentages of people, as much as 75% of people living in poverty, and the lighter colors to smaller percentages. The scope of world poverty is truly staggering. This chart is more complicated than we want to get into here, but it shows on the very bottom the percentage of people living on less than $1 per day in developing regions in 1990, 1994, and 2004. The good news is, as you can see along the bottom, and for almost every region in the top part of the chart, the percentages are going down dramatically. From around 30% of people living on less than $1 a day in 1990 You are now at less than 20% in 2004. There is a clear move that started in the last quarter of the 20th century and continues in the first decade of the 21st century, and that is what the chart indicates: the lowering of the percentage of people living in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is less than $1 a day. And as you can see, 1990, around 30%, 2008, half that percentage, anticipated in 2015, if the current economic crisis does not derail the global economy entirely, is a percentage of about 10%. But these rays of hope, I should caution you, can be somewhat misleading. First of all, the falling percentages in poverty may actually translate into more actual people in poverty as the numbers of the world population grow. But you can see this in this chart, which has on the left rural poverty, on the right urban poverty. If you look over here just on the left, what you see is that even though the percentage of the rural poor fell in the late 20th and early 21st century, the actual number of the poor, do we have it here? The number of the poor in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia actually rose in rural areas and rose also in urban areas. Second, the reduction in poverty worldwide is a global affair, obviously, but it varies tremendously by region. Much of the reduction of the world's poor is concentrated in the two largest countries in the world, China and India, but other regions of the world lag badly, as we saw with over 40% of Africans still in extreme poverty. The hope is that by the year 2015 to bring sub-Saharan Africa down from about its current 40% to just over 30%. That's a very ambitious goal. Third, even within countries, growing prosperity is mixed, with some areas and groups doing much better than others. So to sum up, we've seen that poverty, while falling by some measures, continues to encompass huge swaths of the globe, well over 3 billion people. And extreme poverty, the kind of belly-rumbling poverty, includes as many as 1 billion people. I noted, too, that the existence of electoral democracy, institutional democracy, does not guarantee that, as Barrington Moore Jr. said, everyone, even a majority of the population, will have the opportunity to play a meaningful part in the institutions that determine their lives. They face all sorts of barriers to becoming meaningful parts of the public in electoral democracies. The experience of the poor in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, even in democracies, in those places where the world's poverty is concentrated, they have seen a kind of wrenching exclusion that leaves them far from people who have power or voice. Now, some of their experience mirrors the experience in the 19th century of some of the first democracies, where there were significant struggles, too, to gain access to the important institutions, countries like England and the United States. In those countries back in the 19th century, there was a duality, a tension, in the expression and practice of democracy. On the one hand, there was a rhetoric of equality, and that rhetoric should not be taken lightly. At the same time, the practice was that a small group set up high barriers of exclusion, resulting in huge segments of the population which were unable to take advantage of the opportunities to determine their lives, to become meaningful members of a public. So what I want to do now in the third part of the talk is look at the U.S. case, which is a very instructive case, I think. The U.S. began to urbanize rapidly and admit numerous immigrants in the latter half of the 19th century. At that time, there was a group of gatekeepers into the key institutions, and these gatekeepers were white, they were male, they tended to come from three denominations of Protestantism. They were Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and Congregationalist. They were mostly of English descent, and they were regionally concentrated, with powerful families among them holding the reins of power socially, economically, and politically in cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and so on. And they also controlled the national institutions. They were the gatekeepers into the most prestigious social clubs. They created a notion of the public in the United States, but this notion was narrow. It had very specific criteria for entry. They elaborated all sorts of rules for interaction in their clubs and to entry into their clubs and churches and businesses. As they set out social roles, particularly in their social clubs and in their prep schools, on how to interact with each other, this group did not have any special desire for others to accept their social rules. They weren't seeking to make everyone a gentleman. On the contrary, whenever they had the chance, they seemed to shun other groups, to build walls around themselves, to build elements of exclusion. They built Protestant prep schools for their children with the very intention of separating them from the children of Catholic immigrants. For them, the Catholics were too tied to the authority of the Pope. The Jews were too aggressive. The Italians were too emotional. The Irish, too drunk. Women, too emotional. These people, obviously, in theory, are equal members of American society, but in practice do not have the rational faculties that could allow them to participate in the school boards, to run businesses, to run the social clubs, certainly to be political leaders. So while they maintained an idea of democracy that stressed equality and open access, they maintained a monopoly over key economic, social, and political institutions. They became the guardians of the public sphere. And yet, and this is what's interesting, they failed. They failed in maintaining their barriers of exclusion. They failed in limiting their rules to themselves of what it meant to be a gentleman. Slowly, often painfully, sometimes very slowly, others began to get past the gatekeepers, began to adopt these peculiar, particular rules that somehow came to be called civil and decent rules. A much broader public was created in what one historian called a process of Anglo-conformity. Now, I actually don't like that term, Anglo-conformity, because it implies that the elite group absorbs these people who somehow get through the gates and transforms them through a process of assimilation into people who look just like the gatekeepers. I would argue that actually the rules and culture of what the public became were eventually changed by these people, changed as much by those who scaled the walls as those people themselves were changed by the culture of the public they joined. Now the question is, how did this happen? How did it happen that the walls of exclusion were breached? How did the notion of the American public broaden in the 19th century? My research points to the pivotal role of the Civil War and its aftermath, and how that had a tremendous effect in changing the nature of American democracy. The Civil War was the most extraordinary rupture, not only in political life, but in social life, that the country faced in the 19th century, and perhaps, along with World War II, the most fundamental rupture in everyday life in American history. What happened in the Civil War that led to a change in the nature of the public? First of all, there was an unprecedented government demand for materiel, for guns, for uniforms, for food, for everything to fight this war. And this induced the owners of what were basically regional manufacturing companies that were based in places like Boston and drew their materials from Boston, their raw materials, and sold to a Boston market. It induced them to expand their businesses, to become now national industries, selling to the government, which was directing much of the economic effort during the Civil War. In the following decades, the aftermath, and we see actually this picture which I found is a nice picture, because one, it shows the growth of this tremendous industrial complex here near Richmond, Virginia during the war. That was built during the war, but it was also destroyed during the war, so it had to be rebuilt again after the war. So much of what happened, the destruction during the war, spawned more growth after the war. And in the following decades, these now national industries spawned the growth of all sorts of service industries. All this growth from regional manufacturing to national manufacturing, from regional service industry, from no service industries to national service industries, put a tremendous strain on the upper crust white males who owned and ran these manufacturing firms. The simple fact of the matter was that there were not enough of them. There were not enough managers, there were not enough bankers, there were not enough lawyers. There simply was a labor demand at the very pinnacle of society which could not be met by the white Protestant population that had controlled institutions until this point. And so the result was that the walls of exclusion didn't come down, but they began to leak. Scandinavians and Middle Europeans, including Methodists and those from other Protestant sects, began to enter the prep schools, the elite universities, the white shoe law firms, the industries themselves, and even eventually the exclusive social clubs. The very nature of what the American elite was began to change, and as they absorbed these people, they began to teach them what it means to be a gentleman, what it means to be civil, what it means to be hygienic, and so on. But the labor demand that they had didn't stop with management teams and fancy lawyers. These firms now needed paperwork, which meant they needed secretaries to handle that paperwork. They needed clerks, and so women came to be hired in significant numbers. They needed managers of regional offices. They needed salespeople. They needed clerks. They needed franchise holders. They needed what one sociologist called the less favored ethnics to become part of their business operations. Because even then, the Middle Europeans and the Scandinavians weren't enough. They needed the Slavs. They needed the Southern and Eastern Europeans. They needed the Jews. And one of the interesting things which some historians have looked at is how, during this period, Jews, Irish, Italians, Slavs suddenly became white, because white was the key element that defined and differentiated American society. As these groups, the less favored ethnics and the Scandinavians, entered into their positions, they did two things. First of all, they, quite wisely, learned the rules of the elite group. They had their own rules in their own immigrant societies, and these rules were perfectly good as well. But the particular rules of the elite group were the passport to mobility. And so we had a whole new industry of books of manners and etiquette of what it meant to be civil. And so people from the countryside, immigrant people wanted to look at these books and learn how to become part of the American public. And they began to look precisely like the Anglo-Protestants. They wore the same clothes. Here were clerks in an office. These were not the elites, but they looked precisely like the people from the prep club and the bicycle club that we saw before. The second thing they did was they used their new positions in the industries to demand entry into all sorts of other institutions. They wanted into the prep schools, they wanted into the universities, they wanted even into the exclusive social clubs. They wanted to become part of the public, acting for the common good and trying to control their own fates. They began to bang on the doors of these exclusive institutions. Now, the institutions didn't suddenly open those doors, but the rupture of the Civil War, the tremendous violence, the destruction, and the change in the nature of social relations that occurred during that war and its aftermath set in motion a whole series of struggles which slowly, sometimes over the course of an entire century, changed the nature of the public and changed the nature of American democracy. The public now was larger, it was more heterogeneous in its origins, and yet it was surprisingly homogeneous in its rules for interaction, for negotiating everyday life. Let me turn to the last part of the talk. The experience of the struggle in the United States to scale the walls of exclusion, I think, can be very instructive in determining if today's new democracies can become more than formal democracies, electoral democracies. Can they create a public in which the poor have a genuine opportunity to participate in institutions, to affect the people who make decisions about their lives, to even become decision makers themselves? So my answer to this question, which I posed at the beginning of the talk, as I said then, is a qualified one. International programs to fight poverty have been around for an awfully long time. The first program, as all of you know, was the Marshall Plan, which began in the 1940s. In recent decades, there has been a major change. As I already hinted before, nonprofit organizations have become major players in this game as well, in the fighting of world poverty. Indeed, there's been an exponential growth in nonprofits, or non-governmental organizations, NGOs as they're called, worldwide, involved in fighting poverty, improving health, and many, many other activities. Here's a chart based on some UN data which shows the number of nonprofit organizations worldwide. 1951, fewer than 1,000. In 2003, more than 60,000. There's no shortage of NGOs. Many of these NGOs, from the time of their inception until today, continue to work within the government-to-government paradigm and finding a role within that. That is, they become contractors for donor government agencies, such as contractors for USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, or sometimes they work with host governments, helping Ministry of Health in a poor country. This model that these NGOs have been involved in, and stems from the government-to-government model, is basically a one-way vertical relationship. The donor gives to the recipient. But there has been something different developing. The state of Washington, and the Puget Sound region in particular, participated in this recent explosion of nonprofits working on world problems. In fact, there's a project which I mentioned at the very beginning, the Global State of Washington project. At the end, I'll give you the website for it. This Global State of Washington project was nurtured in the provost's office here, in the Office of Global Affairs. And it did a study in which it found that there are 355 nonprofit organizations and foundations based in the state of Washington, which work internationally on all these questions of poverty and economic development and so on and so forth. And about half of these work particularly on the question of poverty. What became clear to me when we brought many of these nonprofit organizations together at the University of Washington back in June for a forum was that they were adopting a very different model for fighting global poverty. Very different from the government-dominated model, from the one-way vertical relationship. And I stuck the label on this of the Seattle model. The Seattle model has 4 elements to it. It's, by the way, it doesn't only occur in Seattle, but there is an extraordinary concentration here of organizations working along the same line. And while there are very few other cities in the country that have these kinds of concentrations of nonprofits, you could look at a city like Washington, D.C., which does have that, but it really operates there on a very different basis. Nonprofits in Washington, D.C. are very much geared towards government contracts, government funds, and the like. So what was this model? First of all, they were talking about alternative access to the poor. Most of the Washington state organizations have departed from the government-dominated model by forging direct relationships with the poor, foregoing government direction or mediation, often working without government contracts at all. They often work in remote locations where standard delivery is not cost efficient because of lack of roads, lack of phone systems, lack of infrastructure. They work in areas where government personnel are scarce, where the state's presence is very intermittent. A tax collector, an agricultural agent who may come by on occasion to a village, a district court and police force that may be half a day's walk away. What these nonprofits have not yet shown, and which I hope they will show, is staying power. Will they continue to be a presence in these villages, in these remote areas, in years to come? Village Reach is one of the nonprofit organizations that's done an extraordinary job in recent years in the Seattle, based in the Seattle areas. It's worked in Mozambique and now in Malawi, and it has not spurned the government model. It continues to have, in Mozambique, for example, a program that works with the Ministry of Health there. But it has also developed alternative programs of its own with access to the poor. Community-based programs which provide interventions to improve maternal and child health, a social venture that supports a health program and meets community infrastructure needs. The second element of the model is that many of these organizations have moved away from a one-size-fits-all, from a cookie-cutter model or solution to problems of poverty. They have begun to customize their plans based on local conditions, on local culture, on specific needs of communities. Much of this has been encompassed in the phrase sustainable development. The key is the modeling by local needs. Another nonprofit called Bahia Street, which is only a few blocks from here, and which works in Brazil, has offered lessons to other nonprofits about how one can customize programs. First, make sure that the relationship is not a one-way relationship. Empower those who you interact with, the poor in the villages, by giving them power. That is, by creating for them, creating with them, I should say, organizations and means of expressing their voices. Know your culture and that of the community in which your project works, and understand how, when you are in a place, you are going to change the nature of that place. The third element in the Seattle model is that there are goals beyond economic goals, beyond the pure and simple question of putting enough food in people's mouths. Seattle NGOs have connected with the poor on a variety of issues beyond economics. Perhaps the most common is education. Education is obviously a key problem. If we look at this chart for a second, you can see the average years of completion of school is about 10 years, in the advanced countries. It's about 3.5 years. This will show it a little more graphically, although it's a little hard to follow, so stay with me for a second. For each country down here, you have Senegal, Mali, and so on across this grid. You have 3 bars. The first bar indicates what percentage has finished grade 1. The second bar, primary school, and the third bar, grade 9. And the dark part of the bar indicates the poor, the light part, the rest of the population. And what you have, as you can see, is that about 20% of the poor in Senegal finish the first grade, compared to almost 80% of the rest of the population. And when you get to 9th grade, a negligible number have actually finished among the poor, about over 30% of the other population. The statistics are a little more promising in Latin America. If you look at Brazil over here and Peru and Bolivia over here, you see actually substantial proportions of the poor finishing first grade, as many as over 95% in Peru and Bolivia. But when you get to finishing 9th grade, the numbers go way, way down compared to the rest of the population. So some nonprofits like Bahia Street have addressed this question of education directly. Bahia Street Mission says it aims to break cycles of poverty, inequality, and violence by providing high-quality educational opportunities for economically impoverished young women and girls in Brazil. And here are a couple of pictures from their website and some of the discouraging statistics. Nonprofits engaged in microfinance have put most of their effort, obviously, into providing key financial resources that the poor lack. Most of all, credit. Again, if you look at this world map, it shows the dark parts of the map are places where 80% or more of the households have access to some form of credit, and as the colors get lighter, smaller and smaller percentages of the people have access to credit. But microfinance organizations have done more than that. They've tried to work on giving the poor checking accounts, saving accounts, credit cards, health insurance, and more. What they found is that their purely economic programs also have a spillover effect. They call this non-income impacts. including, for example, the lowering of fertility rates among women. It was an interesting study, actually, which tried to determine why lower fertility rates came about in this circumstance of increased access to credit. And the natural thought is, well, people need fewer children, and this is the kind of standard answer. Actually, as it turns out, the study showed that it was that the key factor was a diminishing preference for male babies. And if you have a diminishing preference for male babies, you don't, as you have girls, have to keep trying in order to get your male. And this accounted for a large share of the fall in fertility. It's also found that people who get credit keep their children in school longer. If we go back to the Seattle model, finally, the fourth element is moving from a direct donor-recipient relationship to cooperative structures among the poor, to horizontal relationship. As in many other realms of poverty alleviation, Grameen Bank, under Nobel Prize winner Muhammad Yunus, has led the way. It initiated something it called group lending schemes and used the lending sessions as education sessions as well. That is, when they assembled the women, who mostly were women, here's one group of them, a Grameen Bank's Women's Association, in order to collect their loans weekly, they also talked about health and other fields as well. Grameen thus integrated financial services with other functions in what it called integrated delivery system. The key was recipients developing organizations for group lending schemes that had a much broader impact. So let me conclude by going back to the question I asked earlier. Can the poor become viable members of the public? Can they influence the institutions that shape their lives? Can we see democracy move from formal electoral democracy to a broader participatory democracy? And I think the Seattle model does allow for some optimism. Initiatives that access the poor directly, that take account of their specific conditions, that directly and indirectly address issues beyond putting food in people's mouths, hold out real hope. And perhaps most important of all is the move away, that number 4 point, from a vertical relationship where the poor are simply recipients of aid to new horizontal forms of organization among the poor themselves, from lending groups to cooperatives to producer associations to worker groups. The book Voices of the Poor puts it this way: it's only when poor people can draw on the strength of their numbers and organize themselves that their voices can be heard, that they can negotiate with buyers and sellers, and that they can participate effectively in local governance and government programs intended to serve them. But even if all these elements of the model that I had up there for you come together, will the poor fulfill Barrington Moore's understanding of democracy? Will they have the opportunity to participate in, control institutions that shape their lives? The American 19th century example leads us to both hope and a lot of caution. Hope in the fact that the immigrants and internal migrants to the city who are knocking on the door, who are learning the rules of public engagement, who are organizing themselves into all sorts of cooperatives, can breach the walls. They can get past the gatekeepers. The possibility is there. But caution is dictated as well. Caution in that the ability of excluded Americans to break the monopoly of the gatekeepers came only in the wake of a major historical rupture. These kinds of ruptures can be extremely violent. Not simply a violent eruption, but a sustained violence that disrupts existing ways of doing things, disrupts institutions, disrupts the basis for control in society. Whether the poor today can scale the walls of exclusion and create broad democracy without this kind of rupture and violence is still an open question. Thank you.